On my birthday, my granddaughter put down her fork, looked straight at me, and said, "You don't inspire anyone." She didn't laugh. She didn't flinch. She just delivered the sentence as if she were stating the weather. The air at the table seemed to thicken instantly. The laughter from a moment before, my son telling some work story, my daughter-in-law chiming in with details, shriveled into silence so fast it was almost audible. I felt the whole room pause, just long enough for the words to sink in. Then, as if on cue, they all moved on. My son cleared his throat and reached for the salt. Someone asked for more bread. No one looked at me. I sat there, the weight of her voice pressing into my chest, heavier than the birthday crown my youngest grandson had just placed on my head minutes earlier. The roast chicken in front of me was still steaming, but I couldn't bring myself to pick up my fork. The scent of rosemary and baked potatoes only made me feel further away from the moment, like I was watching my family from behind a pane of glass. I searched for any sign, a sympathetic glance, a soft word, but everyone seemed determined to pretend nothing had been said. I thought about all the nights I'd spent fixing that leaky roof in winter storms, so their bedrooms stayed dry. About the afternoons when I'd walk my granddaughter home from school, holding her backpack so she could skip along unburdened. I thought of the hours I'd spent in that same kitchen years ago, baking cookies with her, showing her how to measure sugar with the flat edge of a knife. Now she looked at me as though I was just furniture. A chair in the corner, a decoration, something that took up space without meaning. The hurt wasn't just emotional, it was physical. My stomach tightened, my throat burned. I tried to tell myself she didn't mean it, that maybe it was just a thoughtless remark. But the way she had looked at me, calm, certain, told me otherwise. She believed it. She believed that I had never been and would never be someone who could make another person want to be better. By the time dessert came, my appetite was gone. The cake, a rich chocolate one my son had ordered from the bakery, sat in the center of the table, candles ready to be lit. "Come on, Dad, let's do this," he said. But his tone was light, distant, like someone talking to a neighbor out of politeness. I told them I wasn't feeling well and stepped away. No one followed me down the hall. In the mirror near the front door, I caught sight of myself. My suit was neat, my tie perfectly knotted, but my eyes looked older than I remembered. Not tired, empty. Like a painting that had been left in the sun too long, its colors faded until the shapes no longer mattered. I stood there, staring, until the sound of their singing reached me faintly from the dining room. They were celebrating without me. That night, alone in my study, I didn't touch the book I had been reading. I just sat in the lamplight, hearing her words again and again. "You don't inspire anyone." They didn't fade. They carved themselves deeper. It wasn't just a remark, it was a verdict. And the way the rest of the family had let it stand made it feel like a sentence I was meant to serve in silence. I didn't know it then, but those words would plant a seed, one that would grow in the dark, pushing through the soil of my hurt until it reached the light. But for now, I just sat there, with the taste of birthday cake I hadn't eaten still haunting me, wondering if the story of my life had already ended without me noticing. Friends, let's take a quick pause. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? And if this story speaks to you, please subscribe and share this video. This is how you help us grow our channel. Now, let's continue. That night, long after the house had gone dark, and the echoes of laughter from the dining room had faded into memory, I sat alone in my study. The lamp cast a dim circle of light on the desk, leaving the corners of the room steeped in shadow. The air was still, heavy, almost expectant, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I pulled open the bottom drawer and began leafing through the things I'd kept over the years. Old letters, folded so many times the creases had grown soft. Notes from my children when they were young, written in the uneven scrawl of small hands. Birthday cards with misspelled words that had once made me smile. There were photographs, too, slightly faded, edges curled, of camping trips, school plays, afternoons in the backyard. In one, my son was no more than 7, sitting on my shoulders, His face split into a wide grin as though the world could never turn cold. In another, my granddaughter, no older than 5, was perched on my lap, her tiny fingers clutching a picture book as if it held all the magic in the world. I remembered how she used to insist I read the same story again and again, until I could recite it without looking at the pages. I'd thought those moments were planting seeds in her heart. I'd thought they would grow into something she'd carry into her own life. But looking at them now, in the quiet, the images felt almost foreign, like artifacts from a history no one else remembered. I couldn't stop asking myself when I had stopped being more than just an old man to them. There hadn't been a single moment, no grand betrayal, no slammed door. It had been a slow erosion. Years of small dismissals, of conversations I wasn't invited into, of smiles that didn't quite reach me. One day I had been the center of their lives. The next I was a chair in the corner of the room, still there but easily ignored. I ran my fingers over a letter I had written to my wife decades ago, back when we were both younger, certain that love and effort could build a world strong enough to withstand anything. In it, I'd promised her that I would always be someone our children could look up to. Reading those words now, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. I had kept my promise as best I could, but what did it matter if no one noticed? The house around me was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick more slowly, as though time itself were reluctant to move forward. I leaned back in my chair, letting the shadows spill over me. There was no one here to see me, no one to ask what I was doing awake, no one to tell me I should get some rest. I realized then how much I had come to live in this kind of solitude, even when the house was full of people. I thought about going to bed, about trying to sleep away the weight pressing down on me. But I stayed there instead, tracing the handwriting of my younger children in the margins of old notes, reading the lines over and over until the words blurred. I wanted to find the exact moment in these papers where things had shifted, but there was no single clue, only the growing awareness that somewhere along the way, the light I had carried for them had gone out, and no one had noticed it fade. The night stretched on, the darkness outside thickening against the windows. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, tired eyes, a furrow that had grown deeper over the years, the faint slump of my shoulders. I didn't look like the man in those old photographs. I didn't look like someone who could inspire anyone. And yet, I couldn't help but feel there was still something left inside me, something they hadn't entirely taken, something they couldn't see. I didn't know it yet, but this room, this night, would be where the first ember of that something began to glow again, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to remind me that I was still here, and that perhaps the story they thought was over had only turned a page. The night didn't let me sleep. I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of the street lamp outside washing the room in a tired yellow. Memories pressed in from all sides, not in a warm, comforting way, but like waves that keep breaking over you, forcing you under before you can catch your breath. I saw myself years ago, standing in the cold frame of a half-built house, hammer in hand, the smell of fresh lumber thick in the air. My hands were blistered and raw, but I remember feeling proud. Each nail I drove was one step closer to giving my family a roof that wouldn't leak, walls that wouldn't let the winter bite through. That house had been more than wood and brick. It had been a promise. Then I saw the countless nights spent in that living room, the one now filled with their polite laughter, when the kids were still small enough to crawl into my lap without asking. I'd read them books until my voice turned hoarse, stories about heroes who stood their ground, about kindness being stronger than cruelty. I didn't just want to entertain them. I wanted to build something inside them, the same way I'd built the walls around us, something that would last. And I remembered the neighborhood then, how the neighbors would knock on our door when they needed help, an extra pair of hands to lift something heavy, someone to mend a broken fence, a ride when the car wouldn't start. I never said no, not because I was trying to earn anyone's gratitude, but because it felt right. It was what you did when you believed in being part of something bigger than yourself. And I had believed, wholeheartedly, that all those little acts were adding up to a life that meant something. But now, sitting in the dark, I realized that in my granddaughter's eyes, none of it existed. Not the house that still stood, because I had built it with my own hands. Not the late nights reading until she fell asleep against my chest. Not the favors for neighbors that had cost me hours, days, and sometimes more. To her, those years were invisible. All she saw was an old man at the table, someone whose best days were behind him, someone whose presence didn't light a spark in anyone anymore. The ache that settled in me then was sharper than the sting of her words at dinner. It wasn't just that she didn't see me. It was that she couldn't. Her world had no room for the man I had been, and maybe, just maybe, that was my fault. Somewhere along the line, I had stopped telling the stories. I'd stopped reminding them what those years had been made of. I had assumed they would remember. I closed my eyes, but the images kept coming. Me, out in the driveway in winter, replacing the brake pads on my son's car so he could get to work the next day. Me, holding the ladder while my daughter hung Christmas lights, making sure she didn't fall. Me, mending the neighbors' porch steps before their granddaughter tripped on them. Small moments, yes, but strung together, they were the threads of my life. And yet, in this new chapter, they seemed to unravel, falling into a pile no one cared to weave back together. By the time the first light of morning crept into the room, I understood something I hadn't wanted to face. Memories alone can't save you. Not if no one else carries them with you. And mine, it seemed, had been left behind in the years I thought we all treasured. I got up, poured myself a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm before I even took a sip, and stared out at the yard. The house still stood, the fence still straight, the neighborhood still quiet. But none of it felt like proof anymore. It felt like the remnants of a story I'd told once, but no one had bothered to remember. What I didn't know then was that the story would find its way back, not through the family who had forgotten, but through strangers who would see the man behind those years and write my name where it couldn't be erased. The days after my birthday passed in a blur, though not because they were busy. If anything, they felt slower, stretched thin and empty, each one a quiet reminder of how easily I could fade into the background of my own home. The house was rarely silent. There were always voices, footsteps, the clink of dishes from the kitchen, but none of it seemed to reach me. I would sit in my chair in the corner of the living room, a place I had chosen years ago for its view of the garden, and watch them talk among themselves. They spoke about vacations they were planning, new restaurants they wanted to try, shows they had discovered. They traded stories from work, laughed over jokes I didn't understand, because I hadn't been there to hear the beginning of them. Sometimes they would glance my way, not to ask for my opinion, but to check if I was still awake. And I was. Too awake, in fact. Every word, every exchange was a reminder of how little space I now occupied in their world. There was a time when every plan had crossed my desk first, when they would come to me not just for advice, but for the reassurance that I could make things happen. Weddings, moves, business decisions. Once my voice had mattered. Now, I was lucky if anyone remembered to tell me the plan after it had already been made. I was learning the uncomfortable truth. They didn't need to exclude me. The world simply moved on without my permission. Even the small, everyday moments reinforced it. My granddaughter would walk in, greet her parents, and breeze past me with a distracted smile that never reached her eyes. My son would head straight to his study to make calls, the door clicking shut behind him. My daughter-in-law would be on the phone with a friend, her voice bright, animated, speaking of things I wasn't a part of. They lived in a circle I could see but not step into. It was strange. How loneliness feels heavier when you're surrounded by people than when you're truly alone. I could hear them laughing in the kitchen, talking over each other, and still feel like I was sitting in an empty house. The distance wasn't in the rooms. It was in the space between their world and mine. I had become a quiet fixture, reliable, unobtrusive, expected to stay where I was placed. At night, after they had gone to bed, I would walk through the house. My footsteps sounded different now, more hollow, more hesitant. I would pause in the hallway and look at the photographs on the wall. Family portraits, vacations, celebrations, images of us smiling together. They told the story of belonging, of closeness, but it was a story frozen in time, no longer true. The people in those frames still had their arms around me, but the real versions walked past without noticing if I was there. The worst part was that I didn't protest. I didn't push my way into their conversations or remind them of my place in their lives. I had learned to sit quietly, to listen, to nod when someone's eyes accidentally landed on me. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being the author of my own story and had become an extra in theirs. And the longer I stayed in that role, the easier it became for them to forget I had ever been anything else. It was in those silent evenings, when the house still hummed with life but none of it touched me, that I began to understand a truth I had never wanted to face. You can live under the same roof and still be invisible. And once invisibility takes hold, it wraps around you like a shadow, so complete that even you start to wonder if you were ever really there. It was late afternoon, one of those pale winter days when the sun can't quite break through the clouds, and the air feels like it has been drained of color. I was sitting in my usual chair by the window, the same one where I had watched the seasons change for years, when a sudden tapping broke the monotony. At first, I thought it was just a branch caught in the wind, brushing against the glass. But then I saw him, a boy from down the street, his breath clouding in the cold air, a wool hat pulled low over his ears. He smiled when I pushed the curtain aside, and in that small, shy smile there was something almost disarming. He lifted a mittened hand, pointed toward the books stacked on the windowsill inside my room, and mouthed something I couldn't hear. I opened the window, just enough for his voice to slip in with the chill. "Thank you for the books," he said. Simple words, barely carried by the wind, but they landed with a weight I hadn't felt in a long time. I had given him those books weeks earlier almost without thinking. I'd been sorting through my shelves, deciding which volumes to keep and which to let go, and he had stopped by with his mother to deliver a community flyer. I'd asked if he liked to read, and when he nodded, I'd pulled down a few old favorites, stories I thought deserved to be carried forward. I didn't expect to hear about them again. But now, here he was, cheeks flushed from the cold, making the effort to come and tell me they mattered. For a moment I didn't know what to say, not because I was overwhelmed, but because the gesture felt so foreign in my life lately. Someone had remembered something I had done, and not only remembered, but valued it enough to come back and tell me. It wasn't family, it wasn't a grand gesture, but it was proof that I could still reach someone, that somewhere, even if only in a small way, I had managed to make an impact. After he left, I stayed by the window, watching his small figure disappear down the sidewalk. The house was still filled with the low hum of conversation from the other rooms, but for once I didn't mind that I wasn't part of it. His words had lit something inside me, a tiny ember against the cold, one that refused to go out. It was strange how such a small moment could push back the heaviness I'd been carrying. I sat there a long time, running my hand over the worn spines of the books that remained, remembering the way each one had shaped me when I first read it. I realized that these weren't just stories bound in paper. They were pieces of myself I had been passing along without even knowing it, and maybe that was enough for now. Maybe I didn't need the approval of a whole table to feel that I mattered. Maybe it was enough to know that somewhere a boy down the street was turning the pages I had once turned, seeing the same worlds I had once seen. I didn't recognize it then, but that knock on the window was the first crack in the wall I had been building around myself. The light that slipped in through that crack would grow in the weeks to come, stretching further than I could imagine, until one day it would land squarely on my name in a place where it could never be ignored again. It began on a gray Thursday, the kind of day that seems to dissolve into itself without ever fully arriving. I had just finished my morning coffee, the house still quiet except for the distant murmur of voices from another room, when the phone rang. It was the school down the road, a place I hadn't set foot in for years, not since attending a holiday concert my granddaughter barely acknowledged me at. The voice on the other end belonged to the principal, warm but hesitant, as if unsure whether I would say yes to what she was about to ask. They were clearing out the library, she explained, sorting through decades of books to make room for new ones, and they needed someone with patience and a steady hand to help. At first I almost declined. I could already hear the voices in my head. Why you? Why now? But something about the way she said it, as though she was offering me a place at a table I hadn't been invited to in a long time, made me pause. I told her I'd come by the next day. Hanging up the phone, I felt an odd mixture of apprehension and curiosity. I hadn't been asked for help in so long that the very idea felt foreign, like trying to remember a language I hadn't spoken in years. The next morning, I walked through the school gates, the familiar creak of the metal hinges carrying me backward in time. The air smelled faintly of pencil shavings and floor wax, and somewhere in the distance, children's laughter spilled down the hallway in uneven waves. The library door was propped open, and as I stepped inside, the scent of old paper wrapped around me, like a blanket I hadn't realized I'd missed. Stacks of books were piled on tables, some with spines cracked from years of eager hands, others with dust jackets so pristine they looked untouched. The principal greeted me with a smile and handed me a pair of gloves, explaining that some of the older volumes were fragile. Her words faded into the background as I ran my hand over the top of a stack, the texture of the covers rough under the thin cotton. I had always loved this feeling, the quiet intimacy of holding a book that had lived a longer life than most people realized. Hours passed without me noticing. I sorted through titles, pausing to read inscriptions on inside covers, names of students from decades past, little notes from teachers to their classes, reminders of a time when books were passed from hand to hand like treasures. With each inscription, I felt a strange tether pulling me closer to something I couldn't quite name, a reminder that words and stories outlive the people who first carry them. Somewhere in that quiet, I realized I was smiling, not the forced, polite smile I had worn at family gatherings, but something unguarded. No one here looked at me as an afterthought. No one here measured my worth by how loudly I could speak or how much space I could take up. In this room, I was simply a pair of hands giving care to something that mattered. When I finally stepped outside that afternoon, the winter light was beginning to fade, and the cold air caught me off guard. But there was something lighter in my chest, a feeling I hadn't carried in a long time. I didn't know then that this invitation, this seemingly small request to sort through forgotten shelves, would be the beginning of something much larger. I didn't know that it would lead me to a moment when my name, once invisible in my own home, would be etched into a place where it could never be overlooked again. The days in the library began to take on their own rhythm, quiet and unhurried, as if time inside those walls moved differently from the rest of the world. Each morning, I would push open the heavy wooden door, and the faint creak of its hinges felt like a private greeting. The air was always the same, thick with the scent of paper that had soaked up decades of seasons, layered with the faint mustiness of dust that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of things that had endured. I would sit at a long table near the back, where the light from the tall windows fell across the stacks in soft rectangles. Some days the sun reached all the way to my hands, warming them as I worked. Other days the light was dim and cold, the world outside a blur of gray through the glass. The piles of books in front of me were my companions. Each one was different under my fingers, cloth covers worn soft from years of use, glossy jackets still smooth as if they'd been opened only once or twice. I handled them carefully, brushing away dust, turning pages with the same care one might give to a fragile letter from a loved one. Inside, I found traces of the lives these books had touched, a faint pencil underline beneath a sentence that must have meant something to someone long ago, a pressed leaf between pages as though a child had wanted to save a piece of autumn. Some books bore the scrawled names of students on the inside cover, written in quick, uneven handwriting. Others carried neat inscriptions in ink, from a teacher to a graduating class, each line steady and deliberate. These marks felt like whispers from the past, voices that didn't fade, even when the people who had made them were gone. It was in those hours, surrounded by nothing but the quiet rustle of turning pages, that I remembered who I had once been. There was a time when I believed in the power of words to change a life, in the way a single story could open a door inside someone's mind. I had believed it enough to read every night to my children, to keep shelves of books within their reach, to treat libraries not as buildings, but as vaults of human memory. Somewhere along the way I had stopped holding that belief close, not because it had died, but because no one seemed to care whether I kept it alive. Now, in this room where no one hurried me, where no one measured my worth by what I could give in return, I began to feel that belief stirring again. I didn't need to speak to anyone for the hours to feel full. The silence was not the hollow kind I knew from my own home. It was a living quiet, a presence that made room for thought, for reflection. It was as if the books themselves were keeping me company, their pages breathing softly around me. I started staying later each day, letting the sun set while I was still bent over some battered spine, my fingertips tracing the texture of the cover. Leaving the library always felt like stepping back into a colder world, but I carried something with me each time, something small, like a coal kept alive in the palm. I didn't realize it yet, but that warmth was slowly knitting back pieces of myself I had thought were gone for good. And as I locked the door behind me each evening, I found myself wondering if books could survive decades on these shelves and still speak to someone. Maybe there was a part of me, too, that could last. Even if no one was listening now, perhaps someday they would. It happened on an afternoon when the library was emptier than usual. The hallways outside muffled, as if the whole school had drawn a deep breath and held it. I was sorting through a box marked Miscellaneous, 1980s. The handwriting faded to a pale brown when my fingers brushed against something that wasn't like the rest. It wasn't a bound book, but a soft, worn notebook, its cover once blue but now dulled to a muted gray. The edges were frayed, the spine bowed from years of being opened and closed, and when I lifted it, a faint drift of dust rose into the light. I opened it without thinking, and there it was, my own handwriting, decades younger, but unmistakably mine. Page after page, the lines were filled with short stories, fragments of ideas, little fables I had once written for the after-school reading circle I used to run. I could see the dates in the corner of each page, the ink sometimes smudged from when I had been too impatient to let it dry. There were notes in the margins, reminders to quote, add more dialogue here, or make the ending softer, small windows into the way I used to think about what would make a child listen, laugh, or fall quiet with wonder. As I turned the pages, memories began to flood in with a clarity that almost startled me. I could hear the soft shuffle of little shoes as they gathered around the low table in the library, the way their eyes would widen when a story took a sudden turn, the collective sigh when it ended too soon. I remembered the thrill of watching them lean forward, not wanting to miss a word, their faces mirroring the emotions I had hoped to stir. I remembered how, after the sessions ended, some of them would linger to ask what happened to the characters after the last line, as if stories could be kept alive just by wanting them to continue. Holding that notebook, I realized how much of myself I had poured into those moments, quietly, without fanfare, without ever expecting them to be remembered. And yet here it was, proof that those hours had existed, that my voice had once carried enough weight to make children stop fidgeting and listen. I traced the faded ink with my finger, wondering how it had ended up in this forgotten box. Perhaps it had been misplaced during some old library reshuffle. Perhaps someone had found it and decided it wasn't worth keeping, but for me, it was as if I had stumbled on a time capsule meant only for my eyes. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the voices of those children come back to me. Not the distant, distracted voices of my own family now, but the eager, unfiltered ones from years ago. I had thought that kind of connection was gone forever, replaced by polite nods and hurried glances. But here was the evidence that it had once been real, and that it had mattered, maybe not to everyone, but to someone. I sat there longer than I intended, the box still half sorted, the light from the windows shifting across the table. It wasn't just nostalgia that held me. It was something deeper, a stirring I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a reminder that the best parts of ourselves don't vanish just because the world stops noticing them. They wait quietly until we find them again. And in that moment, surrounded by dust and the faint smell of paper, I felt a small but certain truth take root. I wasn't finished yet. The weeks slipped by almost without me noticing, each one stitched together by the same quiet routine. I would arrive at the library in the morning, unlock the door, and let the stillness wrap around me like an old coat. The work was simple: lifting heavy boxes, wiping years of dust from covers, arranging the shelves so the spines faced forward in neat, inviting rows. I never thought of it as anything important. It felt like maintenance, the kind of behind-the-scenes labor that kept a place running but didn't leave much of a mark. Sometimes teachers would wander in between classes, looking for a particular book or just escaping the noise of the hallways. They would smile when they saw me, offer a quick "thank you for what you're doing," and disappear again. I always answered with a polite nod, brushing off their gratitude as unnecessary. I was just sorting, just organizing. Anyone could do it. It wasn't inspiring work. It wasn't the kind of thing that made people stop and remember your name. But every now and then, I would catch small signs that perhaps it meant more than I realized. A teacher lingering at the doorway a moment longer, watching me arrange a display of old biographies as though it were something worth seeing. The way students would glance in when passing, eyes drawn for just a second to the newly ordered shelves. Once I overheard a teacher telling another that the library felt different lately, warmer, more alive. I didn't think they were talking about me. How could they be? I was just a shadow moving quietly between stacks. And yet there was a strange satisfaction in the work. Every shelf I finished gave me the faintest echo of the pride I used to feel when I built something with my own hands. It wasn't a house or a fence or anything that could stand against the weather, but it was order carved out of chaos. It was making something better than I'd found it, and perhaps in a place like this, that was enough. I never sought recognition. In fact, I preferred to work when the library was empty, when I could hear nothing but the gentle sigh of pages settling back into place. There was a peace in knowing the job didn't demand my voice or my approval, only my care. I didn't think of it as a contribution to the school's life. I thought of it as a way to pass the hours in a place that didn't remind me of all I had lost. But something was shifting beneath the surface, though I couldn't yet name it. My days were no longer just about filling time. They were about tending to something that had a life of its own. The library had begun to feel less like a room I worked in, and more like a place that trusted me to keep it whole. I didn't realize that trust was being noticed, that my quiet presence was leaving a trace. To me, I was still invisible. To others, without my knowing, I had begun to take shape again. It was on an ordinary afternoon, the kind when the library hummed softly with the turning of pages and the muffled footsteps of children drifting in and out, that I first heard it. I was kneeling by the lower shelves, aligning a row of weathered history books, so their spines sat perfectly straight, when two students slipped in, their voices low and hurried. They didn't see me at first. I was half hidden behind the end of a tall bookcase. One of them nudged the other and whispered, almost conspiratorially, "That's him. That's the grandpa who used to tell the stories about brave people." For a second, I thought they must have been talking about someone else. Perhaps there was another volunteer, someone who came in on the days I wasn't here. I stayed still, my hands resting on the smooth edges of the books, listening as they moved toward the back corner. The second child whispered something I couldn't catch, and then they both giggled in that soft, unguarded way children do when they're recalling something warm. My first instinct was to correct them, to say they were mistaken, that I was just here to sort and clean. But the words never made it past my lips. Instead, I found myself frozen in place, my heart caught between disbelief and something almost like longing. It had been so many years since I had been remembered for my stories. I thought those afternoons in the old school reading circle had vanished completely, swallowed by the years and forgotten by everyone who had once sat cross-legged at my feet. Yet here were two children, too young to have been there themselves, speaking of me as though I were still that man. How had they heard of me? Was it through an older sibling, a parent, a teacher who still remembered the way I used to read aloud? The thought unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite define, like seeing your own reflection in a window and realizing you'd forgotten what you look like. I didn't step out from behind the shelf. I let them pass, their voices fading into the rustle of paper and the quiet click of the door as they left. For the rest of the afternoon, I moved more slowly, my hands lingering on the covers as though each one might carry a piece of the past they were talking about. The notebook I had found weeks earlier was tucked safely in my bag, and suddenly I thought of it differently, not just as a relic, but as proof that their whispers were not just mistaken memories, proof that the man they spoke of had existed. Still, I told myself not to read too much into it. Children have a way of embellishing things, of inventing heroes out of shadows. Maybe I was simply the closest thing they could find to an image they'd been told about. But no matter how many times I tried to brush it off, the echo of their words stayed with me. I could hear them as I locked up that evening, the hallway outside long emptied, their small voices threading through the silence, the stories about brave people. Walking home, the winter air sharp in my lungs, I realized that the smallest whispers can stir something the loudest applause cannot. They had reminded me, without even knowing it, that I had once been more than a quiet figure behind a desk, and though I still wasn't ready to believe it mattered now, some small part of me, deep, stubborn, and still alive, hoped they were right. The invitation came folded neatly inside an envelope with the school's crest on the corner. I found it in my mailbox one evening, tucked between bills and flyers for things I didn't need. At first I assumed it was just another notice about a community event, the kind they send to every household in the district. But when I opened it, the words caught me off guard. We would be honored if you could join us for the school assembly next Friday. No further explanation, no special title or role, just the date, the time, and a polite request for my presence. I read it twice, then left it on the kitchen counter, unsure why it had been sent to me. Assemblies were for students, parents, teachers, the active pulse of the school. I was just the man who moved books around in a quiet corner. The thought crossed my mind that maybe they were inviting all volunteers, that it was nothing personal. Still, something about the formality of the note made me pause. I decided I would go, if only to be polite, and take a seat in the back where I wouldn't be in the way. The morning of the assembly was cold, the kind of sharp winter air that makes the world feel both awake and far away. I wore the same suit I'd worn to my granddaughter's graduation years ago, its fabric a little looser around the shoulders now. As I walked up the school steps, I could hear the faint rumble of children's voices inside, that restless, excited energy that always hangs in the air before something begins. The principal greeted me at the door with a smile warmer than the weather, but her eyes carried a spark I didn't know how to read. She thanked me for coming and gestured toward the auditorium. Inside, the room was already filling, rows of students in their uniforms, teachers scattered along the sides, parents gathering toward the back. I found an empty seat along the far wall, the kind of spot where you can see everything without being seen yourself. I told myself I was just here as an observer, a quiet pair of eyes in a sea of noise. The stage at the front was dressed for the occasion. Dark curtains pulled back, a row of chairs neatly aligned, a podium standing in the center under the bright wash of the overhead lights. The hum of voices swelled and receded like waves, and I let it wash over me, content to fade into it. I thought of all the assemblies I had attended in years past, the speeches, the awards, the songs. My role had always been the same: to watch, to clap at the right moments, to leave when it was over. I expected nothing different this time. As the lights dimmed slightly and the principal stepped up to the podium, I folded my hands in my lap, ready to listen, and then slip out quietly when the applause came. I didn't notice the way a few teachers in the corner were glancing toward me. I didn't hear the faint rustle of papers being shuffled in anticipation of something that wasn't on the printed program. I was certain I was here for no reason other than politeness, a courtesy seat for someone who had done a bit of sorting in the library. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have guessed, was that this was not a morning meant for sitting in the shadows. This was the day the quiet work I thought had gone unnoticed would step into the light, whether I was ready for it or not. It happened so suddenly that for a moment I thought I had misheard. The principal had been speaking about community, about the people who quietly give without expecting anything in return. Her words floated over the rows of students and teachers, warm but general, the kind of praise you hear at events like these. Then she paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd, and her voice shifted, more pointed, more deliberate. We have someone here today who has given this school far more than time or labor, someone whose care has changed the heart of our library, and whose stories have touched generations. And then, without hesitation, she said my name. At first, I didn't move. The sound of it in that room felt strange, as if she had called someone else entirely. A low murmur rippled through the audience, followed by the scraping of chairs as a few people turned to look. My heart tightened, an involuntary clench, like a hand closing around it. I felt the heat rise in my face, not from pride, but from the sharp disorientation of being seen when you've grown used to invisibility. The principal gestured toward the stage, her smile steady, patient. My legs felt heavier than they should as I stood, the wooden floor under me suddenly loud with each step. The students, so noisy a moment ago, had gone still. Even the fidgeting stopped. There was only the faint rustle of my suit jacket as I moved forward, the world narrowing to the distance between my seat and the steps leading up to the stage. I hadn't been on a stage in decades. The last time, I'd been speaking to parents about the after-school reading circle, holding up a book like a shield to hide my nerves. Now there was nothing to hold, no script to cling to. I reached the podium and gripped its edges, the smooth wood grounding me as I looked out over the crowd. 1,000 faces, and yet the silence felt almost intimate, as if the room had folded in on itself. I wanted to ask why I was here, what this was for, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I listened as the principal began to speak again, her voice carrying in that measured way of someone who knows every syllable matters. She spoke of the mornings I'd spent in the library, of the care I'd given to each book, of the way teachers had noticed the atmosphere change. She mentioned the stories, those old tales of courage and kindness, that had somehow found their way into the memories of children who'd never even heard me tell them firsthand. And then, for the briefest moment, she stopped speaking. It was the kind of pause that isn't empty but full of what's about to be said, full of the weight of it. I could feel my chest tighten again, not with fear this time, but with something I couldn't yet name. I didn't know that this silence was the edge of a moment I would never forget, a moment that would shift the ground beneath me in a way I hadn't dared hope for in years. The principal's pause lingered just long enough for the air in the room to feel charged, as if everyone was leaning forward without moving. Then she gestured for me to follow her. I stepped away from the podium, still not entirely sure what was happening, my footsteps sounding impossibly loud in the hush. She led me down the short stairs, through the side door of the auditorium, and into the hallway. I could hear the shuffle of the entire assembly rising to their feet, following behind us in a quiet, expectant current. We walked toward the library. The door stood open, the familiar smell of paper and polished wood spilling out into the hall. But something was different. In the center of the room, where the sunlight from the tall windows fell brightest, a new glass case had been installed along the wall. Behind it, books were arranged like a carefully curated display, their spines catching the light. And above them, mounted on the wall, was a bronze plaque. I stopped without meaning to. My eyes locked on the words engraved in clean, deliberate letters. Library of... followed by my full name. The sight of it was like a physical jolt, the breath catching in my chest. For a moment the noise of the world disappeared, the murmurs of students, the quiet shuffling of feet, even the soft hum of the heating vents. All I could see was that plaque, the way the letters seemed to stand a little taller than the metal they were cut from, as if they refused to sink back into anonymity. I didn't reach out to touch it right away. I just stood there trying to understand how something so permanent could have appeared without my knowing. How the quiet hours of dusting shelves and sorting books had somehow grown into this. My name had not been spoken much in my own home lately. Now it was fixed here, unmovable, in a place where hundreds of children would pass by every day. It wasn't a title or an award that could be boxed up and stored away. It was part of the building itself. The principal's voice returned softly, explaining how the teachers had noticed the change in the library, how the students had spoken about the grandfather who cared for the stories, how they wanted a way to ensure that care would never be forgotten. I caught fragments of her words: inspiration, quiet dedication, legacy. But my mind kept circling back to the fact that this was real, that I wasn't dreaming it from the safety of my chair at home. Somewhere behind me, applause began, slow at first, then swelling until it filled the room. I turned slightly and saw my granddaughter in the crowd. Her eyes were wide, her hands hesitating for a moment before joining the clapping. There was no trace of the dismissive glance she had given me at my birthday table. Instead, there was something else, surprise perhaps, or the early edge of understanding. I finally stepped closer to the plaque, letting my fingers rest against the cool glass that covered it. I didn't need to feel the letters to know they were real. They would be here long after me, catching the morning light, waiting quietly for anyone who cared to stop and read them. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the weight in my chest shift, not gone, but lighter, as if it had made room for something else to grow. At first I didn't see her. My eyes were still fixed on the plaque, the letters of my name catching the light like something newly minted, almost unreal. But as the applause swelled and softened into a scattered hum of voices, I turned toward the crowd, and there she was, my granddaughter, standing just a few rows back, half hidden between two taller students. Her hands were still raised from clapping, though they'd stopped moving, and her gaze was locked on me in a way I had not felt in years. Gone was the practiced disinterest, the way she used to glance past me at family gatherings as though I were part of the wallpaper. Her eyes were wide now, unblinking, as if she was trying to reconcile the man she saw in this moment with the one she had so easily dismissed. Shock lived there, yes, but not the cold kind that distances. It was the kind that draws you closer, the kind that forces you to look again. And threaded through that shock was something more fragile, something I dared not name for fear of watching it vanish: respect. The crowd shifted slightly, people moving to get a better view of the plaque, but she stayed rooted in place, her eyes never leaving mine. I could see the faint tremor of her breath, the way her lips parted as though she might speak. For a moment I wanted her to. I wanted her to say something, anything, that would break the quiet bridge forming between us. But the words didn't come, and maybe that was better. Because what passed between us didn't need to be said aloud. In that gaze, I felt her sifting through memories, searching for pieces of me she might have overlooked. The times I had carried her on my shoulders, the nights I had read to her until she drifted off, the gentle ways I had tried to guide her without forcing her path. I wondered if she was hearing again, in her mind, the words she had spoken on my birthday, words that had stayed with me like a bruise that wouldn't fade. I didn't need an apology. What I needed was this: to see her see me, truly see me for the first time in years. The noise of the room seemed to fade, the conversations blurring into a distant hum. For those few moments, it felt as though the two of us stood alone in that library, the plaque on the wall between us like a quiet truth neither of us could ignore. I didn't smile, and neither did she, but something shifted in that silence, a small movement under the surface, like the first crack in a sheet of ice before the thaw begins. When the principal called the assembly to a close, the crowd began to disperse. She was swept along with the other students, her figure retreating into the hallway's flow of bodies. But just before she disappeared through the doorway, she turned her head, just slightly as if to check that I was still there. I didn't raise my hand or call her name. I simply met her eyes one last time and held them. It was enough. The walk home that afternoon felt different, though the streets were the same as they had always been. The winter air still carried its quiet bite, The bare branches still scraped lightly against the pale sky, but there was a weight missing from my shoulders, a heaviness I had been carrying for so long I'd almost forgotten it was there. My hands were bare, despite the cold. I had left my gloves in my coat pocket without realizing, and the chill felt almost welcome. I could still hear the echo of applause in my ears, but it no longer belonged to me. It had already become part of that library, part of the space where the plaque now lived. When I stepped into my house, the familiar stillness wrapped around me. There were no voices from the kitchen, no footsteps overhead, just the muted tick of the clock in the hallway. I walked to my study, closing the door behind me, not out of habit, but to let the quiet settle the way dust settles on a shelf. The afternoon light slanted across the desk, touching the stacks of papers I had left in no particular order. I sat down slowly, the chair giving that soft, familiar sigh beneath me, and let my mind return to the image of that bronze plaque behind the glass. It would remain there long after I was gone. Children who didn't know my face would still see my name as they walked past, the way I had once read the names of people whose stories I didn't yet understand. Maybe some of them would ask who I was. Maybe they wouldn't. But the point was not to be remembered for the sake of memory. It was that the work, the care, the hours I had poured into that room had taken on a life beyond my own. That was the kind of permanence I had never sought. And perhaps because I hadn't sought it, it mattered more. I thought of my granddaughter, the way she had looked at me today, not with the flippant certainty of her birthday remark, but with something unsteady, something beginning to break open. There had been no apology in her eyes, no quick, clumsy attempt to undo her words. Instead, there had been a recognition, however small, that she had been wrong. And in that recognition, I realized I didn't need to hear, "I'm sorry." I didn't need to stand in the middle of a room and list all the reasons I deserved respect. I had already answered her without a single accusation. I had answered her with my hands, my patience, my quiet persistence. The truth is, the world rarely notices the work done without noise. We live in an age where everything clamors for attention, where worth is measured by how loudly it can be announced. But the kind of influence that lasts is not the kind that shouts. It's the kind that lingers, woven into the fabric of a place, into the habits of the people who move through it. I had thought my life's work had gone unnoticed, that it had dissolved into the air without leaving a trace. Today proved me wrong. I leaned back in my chair, the fading light deepening the shadows around me. There was no parade waiting outside my door, no cameras, no headlines, just me, the steady tick of the clock, and the knowledge that somewhere, just a few streets away, my name rested quietly on a wall where it could not be erased. That was enough. I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I didn't need to win arguments to be right. Sometimes the truest victory comes when you live in such a way that the proof speaks for itself, even if it takes years for anyone to notice. The plaque would not tell the whole story. It could never hold the weight of the nights I had spent building, reading, repairing, giving. But it would be a marker, a signal to those who cared to look closer. And so I let the day end without celebration. I didn't pick up the phone to tell anyone. I didn't wait for the family to return so I could describe the ceremony. I didn't even take off my coat for a long time, just sat there in the quiet, letting the warmth from the library linger in my chest. Because the kind of inspiration worth giving is not the kind that demands recognition. It is the kind that stands silently in a corner of the world, doing its work, until one day someone notices and realizes it has been there all along. Long after the sun had set, I finally rose, turned off the lamp, and left the study. In the darkness, I thought of the children who would walk into that library tomorrow, the next day, and the years after that. They would run their fingers over the glass, maybe even whisper the name they saw there. Most would never know the man it belonged to, and that was fine, because to inspire, you don't always have to be known. You just have to leave something behind that keeps speaking long after you've gone.